History remembers the grand figures, the presidents, the generals, the titans of industry. Their faces are carved into mountains and printed on currency. We know their speeches, their victories, their scandals, but history has shadows. And in those shadows live people whose stories are just as profound, whose lives were just as rich, and whose pain was just as real. They are the whispers in the margins of the textbook, the footnotes to a famous name. Today we're stepping into one of the deepest, most misunderstood shadows in American history. We're telling the story of a first lady who never wanted the title, a woman of privilege who chose a life of hardship, and a wife whose private grief was twisted by public gossip into a cruel and lasting caricature. She was supposed to be the hostess of a nation, but she locked herself away in the private quarters of the White House, becoming a ghost in her own home. This is the heartbreaking, untold story of Margaret Taylor. To understand Margaret, you have to understand the world that made her, a world of stark contrasts, teetering between the refined drawing rooms of the East Coast and the raw, untamed wilderness of the American frontier. She was born Margaret McCall Smith in 1788 in Calvert County, Maryland. Her family was respectable, educated, and part of the planter class. She grew up in a world of structured civility, where a woman's path was clearly defined: a good marriage, the management of a home, and the raising of children. It was a life of quiet domesticity, shielded from the harsh realities of the wider world. But America itself was a nation in its turbulent adolescence. It was a place of immense ambition and brutal expansion. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry, and the country was pushing westward, swallowing vast territories in a relentless drive for land and destiny. This expansion wasn't a neat line on a map. It was a chaotic, often violent collision of cultures. For the U.S. Army, this was their entire world. They were the tip of the spear, sent to build forts, negotiate with or fight against Native American tribes, and secure the ever-advancing border. A life in the military in the early 19th century wasn't a life of parades and dress uniforms. It was a life of profound isolation and constant danger. Officers and their families were stationed in rudimentary forts, often little more than a collection of log cabins huddled behind a wooden stockade, hundreds of miles from the nearest semblance of civilization. Mail took weeks, if not months, to arrive. Supplies were scarce, and disease, malaria, cholera, yellow fever, was a constant, terrifying companion, often more deadly than any battle. This was the world that Zachary Taylor, a young, ambitious Army lieutenant, inhabited, and it was this world that Margaret Smith, a woman raised for a life of comfort and stability, would choose to enter when she fell in love with him in 1809. Her friends and family were likely horrified. To marry a career soldier was to sentence oneself to a lifetime of hardship, uncertainty, and fear. It meant trading the familiar comforts of Maryland society for the mud-floored cabins and malarial swamps of the frontier. But for Margaret, known as Peggy to her loved ones, the choice was simple. Her love for Zachary Taylor was bigger than her fear of the unknown. She married him in 1810, and in doing so, turned her back on the life she was raised for, stepping into a story far wilder and more demanding than she could have ever imagined. Their life together began, as it would continue for the next 4 decades, on the move. They were a military family in the truest sense, their home defined not by a plot of land, but by Zachary's latest assignment. Their early years were a whirlwind tour of the American frontier, from Indiana to Louisiana, from Minnesota to Missouri. Peggy Taylor, the genteel lady from Maryland, learned to make a home wherever the Army sent them. She packed and unpacked their meager belongings countless times, turning drafty, primitive quarters into a haven of warmth and order for for her husband and their growing family. Their first child, Anne McCall Taylor, was born in 1811. Two more daughters, Sarah Knox and Octavia Penill, followed, then a son, their only son to survive infancy, Richard. But the joy of motherhood was shadowed by a constant gnawing anxiety. Life in these remote outposts was precarious. Medical care was rudimentary at best. In 1820, while stationed in Louisiana, tragedy struck with a cruelty that would forever shape Peggy's heart. A virulent fever, likely malaria, swept through their home. In a matter of days, she lost two of her beloved daughters, 3-year-old Octavia and 1-year-old Margaret. The grief was unimaginable. There, in the suffocating heat of a southern bayou, miles from the comfort of her extended family, Peggy had to bury two of her children. There were no grand funerals, no community to share her sorrow. There was only the raw, private agony of a mother's loss, amplified by the profound isolation of her surroundings. This event carved a deep wound in her soul. It solidified a belief that had been growing for years, that the military life, the life she had chosen for love, was a life steeped in sacrifice and pain. It was a life that took and took and took. From that moment on, a quiet bargain formed in her heart. She would endure it all, the loneliness, the primitive conditions, the constant fear for her husband's safety during his campaigns. In the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, and the Second Seminole War. But she made a vow. She promised God that if her husband could just retire safely from the army and spend his final years with her in peace, she would give up all worldly ambitions, all desire for social standing and public recognition. She wanted nothing more than a quiet life on a farm with the man she loved, surrounded by her surviving children. That was her heaven. Her life was a testament to her resilience. While Zachary was away on campaigns, sometimes for months or even years at a time, Peggy was both mother and father. She managed the household, educated the children, and held the family together. The letters between them, though few survive, paint a picture of a deep and abiding partnership. He called her his dearest Peggy, and she was the anchor of his tumultuous world. She wasn't just a wife waiting at home. She was his confidant, his partner in a life of shared hardship. One of the most revealing and rarely discussed episodes of her life was the heartbreak over her daughter, Sarah Knox Taylor. Knox, as she was called, was a vibrant, intelligent young woman who fell deeply in love with a promising young lieutenant stationed under her father's command in Wisconsin. His name was Jefferson Davis. Yes, that Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy. Zachary Taylor, for all his military prowess, was fiercely protective of his daughters. He had seen firsthand the brutal toll that a military wife's life had taken on his own beloved Peggy. He was adamant that his daughters would not suffer the same fate. He forbade the marriage. But Knox had inherited her father's stubborn streak. For 3 years, a painful standoff ensued. Davis resigned his commission, hoping to prove he could provide a stable civilian life. Knox remained devoted to him. Peggy was caught in the middle, torn between her husband's iron will and her daughter's happiness. Finally, in 1835, Taylor relented, though he refused to attend the wedding. Knox and Jefferson Davis were married. They traveled to Louisiana to visit Davis's sister, full of hope for their new life together. And then, the familiar specter of frontier disease returned. Both newlyweds contracted malaria. Just 3 months after her wedding day, Sarah Knox Taylor was dead. The news shattered the Taylor family. For Peggy, it was a cruel echo of the loss she had suffered 15 years earlier. It was another beloved child swallowed by the unforgiving environment of the frontier, and it was another confirmation of her deepest fears about the military life and the dangers it courted. The quiet retirement she dreamed of seemed further away than ever. Her husband was now old, rough, and ready, a gruff, celebrated general, and his star was about to rise in a way that would become Peggy Taylor's worst nightmare. When we try to picture Margaret Taylor, the image that has been passed down through history is a caricature. She's often depicted as a reclusive, uneducated woman sitting in a rocking chair in a dark room smoking a corncob pipe, completely out of her depth. But this image is a cruel distortion, born from political gossip and a fundamental misunderstanding of the woman she was. The real Peggy Taylor was a person of quiet strength, deep piety, and profound emotional depth, a woman whose choices were guided not by ignorance, but by a lifetime of hard-won wisdom and personal pain. Her world was her family. After decades of being uprooted, of raising children in the shadow of war and disease, her singular focus was the well-being of her husband and children. She was, by all accounts, a devoted wife and a loving, if anxious, mother. Her surviving daughter, Mary Elizabeth, known as Betty, recalled her mother as the warm, stable center of their family. Peggy created a home filled with love and order amidst the chaos of military life. She was an expert household manager, a skill honed by years of making do with meager resources in remote locations. She was also a deeply religious woman. Her faith was not for public display. It was a private source of immense comfort and strength. It was this faith that sustained her through the loss of her children and the long, terrifying periods when Zachary was in battle. Her vow to God to trade worldly recognition for her husband's safe return was not a casual prayer. It was a deeply felt, solemn promise that would govern her actions for the rest of her life. The infamous detail about her smoking a pipe is a fascinating piece of historical slander. While it was not entirely uncommon for women, particularly in rural or frontier settings, to smoke clay or corncob pipes for medicinal or relaxation purposes, the story was weaponized against her. Political opponents of Zachary Taylor seized upon this image to paint the Taylors as unsophisticated, backwoods hicks unfit for the White House. They contrasted the pipe-smoking granny with the polished, elegant hostesses of Washington society like Dolly Madison or Sarah Polk. It was a calculated smear, designed to make the war hero president seem common and his wife an embarrassment. One of the most poignant testaments to her character comes from the period of the Mexican-American War. Zachary Taylor was leading American forces in a brutal, controversial conflict. For Peggy, this was the ultimate test of her endurance. She was living on a plantation in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, waiting, always waiting, for news from the front. She followed the battles with obsessive dread, spreading maps across her floor, tracking her husband's movements, and praying incessantly for his safety. William W.S. Bliss, Taylor's adjutant and son-in-law, wrote letters home that give us a rare glimpse into Peggy's state of mind. He described her extreme anxiety and apprehension and noted that she was the most anxious and unhappy woman I ever saw. During the pivotal Battle of Buena Vista, where Taylor's forces were vastly outnumbered, Peggy was convinced he would be killed. Legend has it that she spent the entire time in prayer, and when news finally arrived of the stunning American victory and his survival, her relief was so overwhelming that it cemented her conviction. He had been spared, and now it was her turn to fulfill her part of the bargain with God. So when the Whig Party came calling, seeking to nominate the wildly popular General Taylor for president in 1848, Peggy was horrified. This was not a dream come true, it was a nightmare. She saw the presidency not as an honor, but as a cruel trick of fate, a punishment that would rob her of the peaceful retirement she had craved for so long. She reportedly said, "I have always prayed to God that my husband would be spared the trials of the presidency, and I still hope that he will not be elected." This wasn't false modesty. It was the desperate plea of a woman who had already sacrificed enough. She had given her children, her comfort, and her peace of mind to her husband's career. The White House was a price too high to pay. The whispers started almost as soon as Zachary Taylor won the presidency. Where was the new First Lady? Washington, D.C. was a city that thrived on gossip and spectacle. The role of the First Lady, while not officially defined, had become that of the nation's chief hostess, a symbol of grace, style, and social power. The public expected grand balls, elegant levees, and a charming presence to preside over the White House. What they got was a ghost. Margaret Taylor refused to participate. True to her decades-old vow, she saw her husband's presidency as a burden to be endured, not a platform to be embraced. She declared herself a plain country woman and made it clear that her health was too delicate for the demands of public life. She confined herself almost exclusively to the family's private quarters on the second floor of the White House. She would receive family and very close friends, but she would not descend the grand staircase to greet dignitaries or shake the hands of strangers. The official duties of the White House hostess were passed to her vivacious 24-year-old daughter, Betty Bliss, who handled them with charm and competence. This decision, so personal and deeply rooted in her life's experiences, became an immediate and vicious controversy. To the political establishment and the public, her reclusiveness was baffling and offensive. They didn't see a woman honoring a sacred promise or protecting her fragile peace of mind after a lifetime of trauma. They saw a dereliction of duty. Rumors flew, each more damaging than the last. She was called an embarrassment. It was whispered that the real reason for her seclusion was that she was a coarse, uneducated frontier woman whom the president was ashamed to show in public. The old caricature of the corncob pipe-smoking crone was resurrected with glee by Taylor's political enemies. They painted her as a sullen, ignorant figure hiding in the attic, a national disgrace. In an era when women, especially prominent women, were judged almost entirely on their social performance, Peggy's withdrawal was seen as a profound failure. There was a heated historical debate, both then and now, about her actions. Was she simply fulfilling a private, religious vow? Or was she, as some critics claimed, selfishly shirking her responsibility to the nation? Some historians have argued that her seclusion was a symptom of depression, or what we might now call post-traumatic stress disorder, the culmination of decades of anxiety and loss. Her health was genuinely frail. She suffered from chronic ailments exacerbated by the stress of her new position. But to frame it solely as a medical issue misses the point. Her choice was also an act of defiance. In a world that demanded she perform a role she never wanted, she simply refused. It was a quiet, passive rebellion, but a rebellion nonetheless. She would support her husband in private, manage the domestic affairs of the White House, and tend to her family, but she would not be put on display. She would not pretend to be a socialite. She would not break the promise she had made to God in the darkest moments of her life. One of the few people outside the family to see her regularly was Verena Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis. Despite the past tragedy with Sarah Knox, Peggy had maintained a cordial, even warm relationship with the Davis family. Verena described the so-called invisible First Lady not as a recluse, but as a pious, gentle, and reserved woman who, when you sat with her privately in her upstairs parlor, was a lovely, gentle-voiced companion. She spoke of Peggy's kindness, her devotion to her faith, and the ever-present sadness in her eyes when she spoke of the children she had lost. This is the hidden truth of Margaret Taylor's time in the White House. While Washington society buzzed with malicious gossip downstairs, upstairs, a tired, grieving woman was quietly living out the final chapter of her life on her own terms. She had weathered Indian attacks, cholera outbreaks, and the death of her children. She had crossed the country in wagons and on steamboats, making a home in the harshest of conditions. The whispers of Washington's elite were nothing to her. She had endured far worse. Her silence was not weakness, it was a fortress she had built around her heart. Margaret Taylor's story might seem like a small, sad footnote in the larger sweep of American history. She was First Lady for only 16 months, and in that time she made no public speeches, hosted no famous parties, and championed no political causes. By the traditional measures of historical significance, her tenure was a void. But to dismiss her is to miss the profound and enduring meaning of her life. Her true significance lies not in what she did, but in what she refused to do. In an age of relentless ambition and political theater, Peggy Taylor represents a powerful counter-narrative. She is a testament to the idea that a life of value is not necessarily a life of public acclaim. Her story forces us to question our assumptions about power, duty, and the nature of partnership. While her husband Zachary pursued a life of public service and military glory, she held fast to a different set of values: family, faith, and private peace. Her life was a quiet insistence that there are realms of human experience more important than fame or political influence. Her deliberate withdrawal from the public eye has had a long-term cultural impact, shaping the conversation about the role of the First Lady. She was the first to so starkly reject the public-facing aspects of the position, setting a precedent that, while rarely followed, has remained a point of reference. Her story highlights the immense, often unspoken pressure placed on political spouses. It reminds us that these are not just symbolic figures, but human beings with their own histories, traumas, and desires. Every time a modern political spouse expresses a desire for privacy or struggles with the glare of the spotlight, they are walking in the shadow of Margaret Taylor. What can we learn from her? Perhaps the most important lesson is one of empathy. It is easy to judge historical figures by our own standards, to label Peggy as reclusive or inadequate. But when we understand the context of her life, the profound losses she endured, the constant fear she lived with, the solemn vow she made, her actions become not only understandable but deeply human. She teaches us to look beyond the public caricature and see the private person, to recognize the hidden grief and quiet strength that often lie beneath the surface. Her story also matters because it humanizes a period of American history that is often reduced to battles and political debates. Through her eyes, we see the true cost of westward expansion and military life. It wasn't just about glory and manifest destiny. It was about families torn apart, children lost to disease, and women living in a state of constant nerve-shredding anxiety. She gives a voice to the countless forgotten women of the frontier, whose sacrifices were essential to the nation's growth, but whose stories were never recorded. In the end, Margaret Taylor's time in the White House was tragically short. In the summer of 1850, after just 16 months in office, President Zachary Taylor fell suddenly ill with a stomach ailment and died. Peggy was inconsolable. The very event she had dreaded, his elevation to the presidency, had in her mind led to his death. The White House, which she had viewed as a prison, had become the place where her worst fears were realized. She had finally gotten her husband back from the army, only to lose him to politics. Her legacy is a quiet but powerful challenge to the very notion of worldly success, a haunting reminder that the greatest honors can sometimes bring the greatest sorrow. After the president's death, Margaret Taylor finally vanished from the public eye completely, just as she had always wanted. She left Washington without fanfare and went to live in quiet seclusion in Mississippi, refusing all interviews and requests for portraits. She was so successful in her withdrawal from the world that for decades, no authenticated image of her was known to exist. She became a true ghost of history. She died just 2 years after her husband in 1852, broken by grief. Her life was a paradox. She was the wife of a celebrated general and a president, yet she craved only obscurity. She lived in the executive mansion, yet her true home was the memory of a simple life that was stolen from her. The world remembers her husband as old, rough, and ready, a hero of the Republic. It barely remembers her at all, and when it does, it is often through the distorted lens of political slander, the pipe-smoking recluse. But Margaret Taylor's story is not one of failure. It is a story of incredible endurance, quiet dignity, and a love so profound that she was willing to be misunderstood by the entire world, just to honor it. She reminds us that not all strength is loud. Some strength is found in the quiet refusal to be something you are not. Some heroes don't lead armies. They simply hold a family together in the face of unimaginable hardship. Margaret Taylor never wanted to be a public figure, but in her silent, steadfast life, she left behind a legacy more poignant and thought-provoking than any grand political achievement. She was the first lady who chose love over glory and peace over power. And in the quiet corners of history, that is a story worth remembering.